Chinese President Xi Jinping after imposing an even higher tariff of 125% on China.
34% tariffs on all US goods coming into China. That's now been increased to 84%.
China, the giant economy, which has recently been at the centre of world trade, hit the table with an unexpected decision the day before yesterday. In response to the harsh tariff war launched by the Trump administration, China announced that it would impose an 84% tariff on US goods. As soon as this announcement was made, a cold wind blew through the global trade arena. The European press interpreted this move as China is ringing the bell of reckoning. World markets had already been looking anxiously at trade tensions between the US and China for some time. However, Beijing's 84% tariffs have led some to say the biggest economic spat in history is only just beginning. The tariff, which will be imposed on a wide range of products from true toys, from US electronics to agricultural products, is likely to further harden the ice between the two countries. On the same day, the European Commission said that this showdown between the US and China is shaking the entire global balance. If we don't take the necessary measures, Europe could also suffer huge losses, some EU leaders said. Analysts watching the situation closely argue that the 84% rate is only a symbolic start and that Beijing could further expand the tariffs with additional lists. Considering the size of technology products imported from the US in recent months, this move is likely to create ripples not only in China, but also around the world. This step is a response to the disproportionate tariffs imposed on us. We do not want to have problems with anyone, but we will not hesitate to defend our rights if necessary. Shortly after Beijing's decision, various statements came from the EU, with Brussels saying, if the US does not show a conciliatory attitude on tariffs, the European Union is ready to impose similar sanctions. The world press updated the headlines by saying, the fuse of a multi-dimensional trade war has been lit. Just as the impact of these news was still lingering, an unexpected development took place yesterday morning. The Washington administration issued a press release announcing a 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs. But it was soon realized that the scope of this decision excludes China. In other words, while Trump has said that he might put the brakes on tariffs on Europe or some other countries, he is not willing to back down on tariffs on China. With this news, the markets, which were expecting some relief, became tense again, because the trade gap between the US and China has deepened with this announcement. Washington's emphasis that we will soften our relations with Europe, but our stance towards Beijing will not change, opened a completely different dimension to the already tense situation. European voices saying the US should stop treating the EU as a substitute player in its anti-China offensive are also feeding this tension. In particular, Trump's spokespeople have said the president will not back down when it comes to American interests. The tariffs will remain in place until we find a reasonable solution with China. According to the information announced by CNN at midnight last night, and based on White House sources, Trump also shared the sentence, "We're taking a 90-day break on reciprocal tariffs," but that doesn't include China. On his personal social media account, this post received thousands of interactions in a short time and became the first item on the world agenda. Although the anxious wait on Wall Street seems to have eased somewhat, the tough stance on China continues to unsettle investors. Some economists are cautious, saying European markets may benefit from the break, but the tensions with China are big enough to affect the heart of global trade. 2 days ago, another harsh statement came from Beijing. China shocked the world by promising decisive and effective measures after Trump imposed tariffs of 104%. Arguing that this tariff rate is gigantic and will almost completely exclude Chinese products from the US market, Beijing said, "We will not succumb to such a threat. If necessary, we will establish different supply routes, diversify our production, and accelerate the search for common markets. We will also impose serious restrictions on American goods." CNN announced this news to the world with the headline, "China announces it will retaliate against US restrictions." The 104% tariff is seen as the culmination of a series of tax measures announced by the US in the previous weeks. Beijing is now keeping the details of what kind of package it is preparing in response a closely guarded secret. The rapid escalation of the global trade war is raising the concerns of many countries. A statement from Germany said, "We have to take a strategic stance as the EU in the face of such global tensions. Otherwise, we risk antagonizing both China and the US." The French president said, "It is not in Europe's interest to fuel the US-China conflict. We call all parties to the dialogue table." Nevertheless, Trump's 90-day break in tariffs on European countries is seen as a move that could soften the EU's clear reaction so far. This is because Brussels may refrain from taking a firm position in favour of China when a compromise approach is possible. This is precisely why Beijing has been trying to engage more diplomatically with the EU in recent days. Going back to 2 days ago, China's announcement of decisive and effective measures came at a press conference in Beijing. The Commerce Ministry spokesperson called Trump's tariffs disproportionate and aggressive and said, "We will not submit to such an imposition. We may cut or even stop our exports to the US in relevant sectors. At the same time, we will find new partners for the purchase of strategic products. This is not a warning, but an expression of our right to legitimate defence." International analysts say this statement carries the message that Beijing will play all its cards if the tariff escalation is not stopped. Some experts say that this harsh stance was already expected, and that the real surprise was that the US fueled tensions with its "we're taking a break, but not China" move. Finally, the sentence that sticks in everyone's mind is summarized in the headline, "China vows to counter Trump's bullying tariffs as global trade war escalates." This is actually from a few days ago, but it is one of the most representative statements of Beijing's overall stance. Chinese foreign ministry sources described Trump's high tariffs as bullying and said, "This is a clear attack on the basic principles of international trade. The US cannot unilaterally set the rules. We will not hesitate to take any steps to protect our own economic interests." This harsh message was widely echoed in the world press, with comments such as, "Polarization is gaining momentum. A peaceful solution is difficult." At a time when the US and China are at such an all-out confrontation, the number of people who agree with the view that the door to dialogue is closing a little more every day is increasing. The question, who will benefit from this confusion, has become a frequent question in the public opinion. Some economists believe that these harsh policies initiated by the US to close the trade deficit may actually put American companies in a difficult situation. Especially in the technology and automotive sectors, there are supply chains dependent on China. Breaking these chains could increase the costs of American manufacturers. On the other hand, China has the capacity to turn every crisis with the US into an opportunity to strengthen its own technology brands. Therefore, it remains unclear what exactly Trump is aiming for or whether he will be able to achieve it. This is where the phrase decisive and effective measures continues to weigh heavily on global markets. Last night's news that Trump announced a 90-day suspension of reciprocal tariffs, except for China, brought to mind the question, will the trade war slow down? Albeit briefly. However, those who saw the phrase "China is excluded" in the second half of the statement immediately realized that this possibility was very weak. The Washington administration is sending a clear message that we can make a temporary truce with Europe, Canada, or Japan, but we will not tolerate China's practices. This means that in the short term, US-China tensions will intensify. All eyes are now on Beijing, wondering, if Trump did not include China in the 90-day break, then what will Beijing put on the table? Predictions are that China will also announce new tax packages or sanctions. China's choice of the term bully is a matter of debate in diplomatic circles. Beijing sees the unilateral US tariff hikes as a political maneuver, not just an economic one. Protecting our national sovereignty and economic independence is our most fundamental right, Chinese officials say, adding that Washington is disregarding the rules of the World Trade Organization. There is similar criticism from European countries, but the EU is trying to strike a diplomatic balance on the issue. We want to maintain trade with China, but we will not give up the American market, EU leaders say, trying to create an advantageous position for themselves in this mess. However, the escalation of a global trade war carries risks for everyone. In the US, there is a significant segment of the population that supports Trump's aggressive policies. They argue that China has exploited the US for years and now they should pay the price. According to this group, China's cheap labor and state subsidies have put American producers in a difficult situation and widened the trade balance against the US. Liberals, on the other hand, continue to warn that such drastic measures will have a boomerang effect and we will collapse our own economy. For now, an electorate with absolute support for Trump continues to believe that whatever the president does is right. That's why the White House sees no harm in taking the step of 90-day break, except for China. Because in domestic politics, the high tariff policy continues to find sympathy among Trump's voter base. Of course, China is only one part of this equation. There are interconnected production lines around the world, and the US's neighbours are also affected by the trade shake-up. For example, companies from countries like Canada and Mexico used to transit through the US in their trade with China. The 84 or 104% tariffs will also affect the prices of goods in transit. This could lead to fluctuations in the North American free trade area. According to recent reports, Canadian companies are already planning to reduce exports to China via the US. This is because no one can cope with the huge tax burden. Mexico, on the other hand, is preparing to revise its customs regime, saying we have to protect our interests too. Two giant economies, the US and China, are at the center of all this chaos. While the news of the 90-day break has raised the excitement of business circles, the exclusion of China is a factor that adds to the tension. In this situation, the likelihood of a compromise in the near future seems slim. Europe is caught in the dilemma of we can relax our relations with the US to a certain extent, but we don't want to completely turn our back on China's interests. Emerging economies such as Russia, India, and Brazil are also weighing the pros and cons of this trade war. If the US and China clash, can we get a piece of the action? May be tempting for some regions, but no one can predict where a global economic shakeup will lead. China's 84% tariff plan announced a few days ago seems to be the last straw. With this decision, Beijing announced to the world that we can respond violently to US trade attacks if necessary. This tax, which will be felt especially in technology, electronics, and agricultural products, has caused concern among US manufacturers. Our costs have already gone up because of Trump's tariffs, and if we are now excluded from the Chinese market, our business will become even more difficult, some American companies say. This has become a vicious circle. The US raises tariffs, China retaliates, Trump announces additional tariffs, Beijing promises further measures. It is unclear how to get out of this cycle. Yesterday's announcement that Trump suspends reciprocal tariffs for 90 days, excluding China, is almost like the final act of this confusion. Investors breathed a brief sigh of relief in the hope that the White House might soften. But the exclusion of China reinforced the fact that Washington and Beijing are still at the center of the trade war. If a compromise is reached between the EU and the US in these 90 days, the conflict between China and the US will become even more pronounced, market experts said. The two giant economies, which have become increasingly isolated, may continue to escalate tensions. Finally, the article, China vows to counter Trump's bullying tariffs as global trade war escalates, summarizes Beijing's position. With the US taking such drastic steps, we can also move away from diplomatic language. We will not give in to bullying. This points to a major power struggle on the world stage. Trump is sending a message to his base. I'm standing tall. I'm defending the interests of the United States, while China is pushing back, saying, we have known for centuries how to defend our territory and our economy, and we will not surrender to anyone's imposition. This strategic rivalry between the two countries is not limited to trade statistics. It is fueling a confrontation that could spill over into the political, military, and technological spheres. For the moment, the picture is dark, but a new development could happen at any moment. Maybe Beijing will surprisingly sit down at the table with the US and say, okay, let's find a compromise and ease tensions. Or Trump will make the 90-day break on the European front permanent and get even tougher on China. Such a path could have radical consequences that could reshape global supply chains. This great fight between economic nationalism and free trade is likely to determine the course of the world economy for many years to come. Every day brings new announcements from China and harsh statements from the US. Europe, on the other hand, is worried about being caught between the two giants, but has not given up looking for opportunities. Global companies are at a loss as to which side to invest in or which market to prioritize. Of course, it is not easy to predict who will be the winners and losers in this turbulent period. In trade wars, both sides usually suffer, say many economists. Others are less pessimistic, saying competition can lead to the emergence of new markets and the stabilization of existing ones. Yet the fact remains that the trade wars are not just about tariffs, but reflect a major contest over the principles on which the international system will be based. The US and China are the two polar opposites in this conflict. Europe, Russia, Japan, and other regional powers are busy defining their positions. If the 90-day break announced last night had taken on a different dimension, there might have been hope for trade peace. But since China has been excluded, there is a strong view that tensions have not eased, but rather intensified. What do you think about this? Will such a confrontation between the world's two largest economies cause lasting damage to global markets, or will a compromise somehow be found? Can China really bring Trump's so-called bully tariffs to China's knees, or are we in for a prolonged jolt? Maybe tomorrow morning we will see news headlined, "Trump backs down," or "China turns the table." For now, everything is a possibility. The best thing to do is to watch developments closely and be prepared for surprises. We will continue to report news on this subject on our channel. You can share your thoughts in the comments and turn on your notifications by subscribing. The shape the global trade war is taking today has the power to determine the economic dynamics of tomorrow. Let's end here for now, but it is clear that this great showdown between the US and China will occupy the headlines on the world stage